go. All right, guys. Okay, so welcome. This is a worldview class. For those of you who don't know why you're here or why we're doing this, it's because as part of Elders Academy, we, as our curriculum, have set down that there needs to be an introduction to worldview. So we thought worldview is really interesting, so why not make it available to the entire church? So that's why it's here. It is basically the lecture portion. It's about a 6-hour class, but we're doing it in 3 steps. So this is part 1, which is dealing with the introduction and the concept of God is nothing. So there's that. You'll notice that there's a microphone in the middle of the room. The reason why we put that there is because the nature of us recording means that we need to hear when people are interacting. So if you want to use the microphone, like if you want to literally go up to the microphone and talk to it, you can when it makes sense. And this is that type of class where you get to ask questions if you need to. But that's why it's there. It's not because we're trying to have like a big question answer forum. It's just so that when people do interact, we have it. We have a slideshow. I put it together real quickly, but it should help us to get through it, and we kind of have a lot to cover, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So this is Worldview 101, Class 1. Do you want to add anything to the introduction?
No, actually I don't.
Okay.
I don't have anything to add to that. No.
All right, so when we're talking about worldview, this class in specific is, like I said, a 101 class, and it's dealing with a simple overview of how the elders teach worldview. If you want to get into the depth of other religions and things like that, then you're going to look at some of the later classes in the Elders Academy. This is the intro to dealing with comparative religions and worldview and so on and so forth. So, what is worldview? So, worldview is basically a simple way to describe our thoughts and our actions as one thing. There you go. When you're talking about worldview, you're talking about thoughts and actions. And basically, what it does is it acknowledges that people aren't silos of information. In our culture, we tend to separate things and say that everything is a silo. I have like multiple hats that I put on for multiple things. But when we're talking about worldview, we're describing those things under one hat. The thing to note is that everybody has a worldview. I don't know if there you go. It connects all areas of a person's life. The thing to note is that everybody has a worldview. Now, the purpose of a worldview is essentially to explain our experience of the world, and basically any philosophy can be judged by how well that worldview succeeds in doing so. Do you have anything you want to add there, James?
I put that last line in.
There you go. So, are there any questions yet?
So does everybody think they have like the briefest of understanding of what a worldview is?
Yes?
Yes?
Okay.
Am I seeing nodding heads?
Okay, good.
Well, I'm kind of seeing nodding heads. I can't hardly see on this side at all.
Okay, so why are we talking about it? Well, the simple reason is that Christians are called to have a worldview. We are called to be a disciple of Christ, and in being a disciple of Christ, we are supposed to holistically love God. And there's 2 main ways that we do that. So the first one is that we adopt his way of thinking, and the second one is that we adopt his way of living. So there's nuances to that, but that's essentially that, right? And if you recall, a worldview is thoughts and actions. As Christians, it's adopt Christ's thoughts and Christ's actions. So we are all called to have a worldview, and as Christians, we understand that, and we bring it under a holistic umbrella of discipleship in Christ. So Christians are therefore called to have a worldview. The other reason why we're talking about it is because when people don't have a formed worldview, they basically can't operate holistically. And this is a problem. The reason why it's a problem is because when we ignore a single part of a person and bring up another part. So let's say that we pursue our sexuality, for instance, which is a common hotbed thing of the day, right? But we ignore other aspects of our being, then that actually causes a system failure in how humans are, because we are meant to operate holistically. So the thing to note is that there are actually many worldviews. Oh, that's weird. It's backwards. The thing to note, yeah, there you go. The thing to note is that there's actually many worldviews. Christianity is only one worldview. Now, we believe fully that Christianity obviously is a true worldview, that it deals with things correctly, and that it actually works. But there are many worldviews, and Christianity is only one of them. So to interact with the world means better equipping ourselves by understanding worldviews. Specifically, to interact with the world as evangelists, or converts, or mentors, or even ourselves as disciples in Christ, it's helpful for us to grasp the concept of the worldview and to be introduced to the basics of them. And to be introduced to the basics of them, there are three premises that we operate with when we're talking about worldview. And these premises we have found to sort of span the gamut of the infinite number of nuances in regard to the worldviews that are out there. And so when the elders teach worldview, when we teach religion, when we teach philosophy, we usually start with these three premises rather than trying to hit every single nuance that's out there. Rather than hitting, Hinduism and Buddhism and Shintoism and Taoism and the list goes on and on. Instead, what we do is we look at the premises that create the nuances of the varying types of worldviews. So understanding these three should help us to understand basically all religions and therefore all people. And it will make us more effective at communicating the gospel as evangelists, as mentors, and even in our own relationship with God as disciples. So, any questions so far?
Is a premise the same as like a presupposition?
Yeah, basically.
It's basically its foundation.
Right.
When you boil everything down, this is what the main premise is.
When we reduce it. Yes. Right.
Yeah. So you're bringing it down. You're
Yeah.
condensing things down to what it is that they're standing on, basically. When everything, instead of whatever language or adjectives that they use to describe things, what's the meat of it? What does it really say?
Okay. Thank you.
So you want to take the next section?
Yeah, those basic premises.
Yeah.
All right. I have fancy slides.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. All right, so the world describes ontology. Ontology. I said it right once. Ontology. So ontology, we've used the word a couple of times already. It's the study of nature's being, their complete being, right? All inclusive. So by seeking to answer two basic questions in the realm of anthropology and theology. The basic question, who is man? Right? That's going to be your anthropology. And then the question, who is God? Which is going to be your theology. Those are the two basic things that you're looking at for who you are and how you view the world.
When you're looking for these premises, those are the things you're looking for. How is this nuanced idea of how the world operates and how we operate in it answering the question of who is God and who is man?
All other nuances stem from how these two questions are answered, and then they get put together or synthesized together. So there's three basic premises that create all of the worldviews. So no matter the plethora of ideas that we come up with, they can all be boiled down to these three things. First one is God is nothing and man is nothing. The second one is God is everything and man is everything. And then the third is God is other and man is other. I know you're saying, what's other than nothing or everything? There's a bunch in between. Basically, you're seeking with this to understand a religion or a culture and to be able to meaningfully interact with it. You have to define these premises within that culture and religion in order to do that. Any questions on that? So I just want to make sure there's a basic understanding here. When we're talking about these basic premises, when we're talking about worldview, this is how we see everything. This is how we decide what actions we're going to take. This is how we decide how we're going to act, how we're going to respond to things, where it is that we get our information from, how we inform ourselves in order to be able to take those actions. Without a good understanding of that, if, like Josh said, we take pieces of those instead, it creates problems because it's not a complete, holistic process for us. It's broken up. If you're different here than you are out there, it's going to create a fracture for you, and it'll create big problems in how it is that you view yourself and how others view you as well.
So these premises of God is nothing, man is nothing, right? These various premises, these are conclusions that people come to about the anthropology and the theology. So when we say there's three of them, what we're saying is that everybody answers the question of anthropology and theology with one of these three options. That's what we're saying. Go ahead.
So you're saying all theologists and anthropologists in the world will ask these three questions?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, they'll ask the two questions.
Oh yeah.
And they'll answer it one of these three ways.
Yeah. Or they'll be on a journey to coming to that conclusion.
My question is, can those things be mismatched, like God is nothing, man is everything?
Sort of, and we'll get into that. Yeah. The basic answer is no, but the actual way that plays out is that there is not really a difference between the first two. So yes, there is a spectrum of understanding, but in terms of what we're talking about, we're going to reduce everything down to these because it is much easier than trying to constantly learn the nuance. And religion changes by the nature of it, at least what we call orthopraxy. So there's something called orthodoxy, which is how something, which is the what of a religion, and then there's orthopraxy, which is the, I guess you'd call it the how it works out, like how people deal with it, right? So religion tends to change its orthopraxy over time. Where we are at is, as Christians, we are called to always have the same orthodoxy, but most world religions don't actually have an orthodoxy that doesn't change. It's something that has grown and altered itself over time. So when it comes down to it, it's not really helpful for us to try to constantly figure out the orthodoxy of a religion. You know, what is Buddhism 1,000 years ago versus, versus 500 years ago? And to constantly change the definition of Satanism and Gnosticism and things like that. It's not a worthwhile pursuit because it's endless. So it's better for us to move past nuance and figure out the base premise that people are operating off of. And so yes, what we are saying is that when you look at the base premise, you find that there are similar traits in basically all religions that can be divided into these three categories, these three premises. Any more questions? Nope. Okay, let's move on. So if you haven't guessed, we're talking about God is nothing tonight. Now, the next week we will be talking, which is next month, is that correct?
Yes.
So next month we're going to be talking about God is everything, and then after that we'll be talking about God is other. So tonight we're going to deal mostly exclusively with God is nothing, although as was alluded to, there's an interesting crossover if you are really paying attention. So when we get to God is nothing, basically when we're looking at defining it, it's this. The idea that God is nothing is usually expressed something like God does not exist. That essentially he is a construct of human imagination in order for us to explain the unexplainable and to displace guilt at the inability to positively affect one's environment. That is the basic way that you would understand it. There's another way, which is that God is not a supreme being, but in fact the opposite, that there basically is no God. People suffer through the thought of being. Non-being, however, is the very basis of existence itself. So these are very philosophical positions, but there's a lot of nuance that comes from these positions that you see in everyday life. And the reason why we chose to start with God is nothing is because we live in a Western society. And Western society uses God is nothing as the basis for how it runs. Its premises is that God is nothing. That's not necessarily how it started, but it's how it's evolved.
Josh?
Yeah.
What do you mean by non-being is the very basis of existence itself? Could you explain that differently?
Yeah, so okay. So let's unpack this. So God is not a supreme being, but the opposite. Absolutely nothing. Right? So there's nothing that exists. Right? So people suffer through the thought of being as if being is a real thing, except for being is not a real thing. The idea of personality, for instance, belonging to a rock. Like why would we wouldn't think that a rock has personality? Like that's not scientific, right? So that's the idea. The idea here is that non-being is the very basis of existence itself. The idea of being is contrived. It's something that a rock has thought up. And it's important to understand that what we're dealing with as Christians, we view as irrational. So when we say God is nothing, we're not saying as Christians this is what we should believe. We're saying this is what's believed at the premises of these belief systems. Yes, LU.
How does that differ from God does not exist?
It doesn't. That's the point. That's the point. Is that these things are similar. They're nuanced in their application. So people will come along and say, "I'm not an atheist. I'm an agnostic. I'm not an atheist, I'm a naturalist," and so on and so forth. But at the heart of what they're saying, the premises is exactly the same. It's just they're paying attention to the nuance and they want to be defined by the nuance. So specifically, to give you an example of that, let's talk about naturalism. Right, there's some examples. Okay, there's more than this, but naturalism, atomistic reductionism, nihilism, these are belief systems that exist in Western culture. And so now let's go ahead and explore that in naturalism. There you go. So God is a man-made construct according to naturalism. So naturalism is basically the idea that nothing exists that isn't in nature, and nature is all that exists. That's essentially the idea of naturalism. And so God is just, he's a construct that people in nature have made. Don't ask me how he got the concept of people, but it's there. So the idea is that man has evolved beyond his biological parts to now have this idea of being, or whatever you want to say, and that truth is essentially whatever exists. That's the basics of naturalism when you start putting it through the filter of the two things. What are the two things? Who is
God, and who is man?
Very good. So what is the anthropology of naturalism, and what is the theology of naturalism? That's it. That's essentially what it is. Now let's move on and juxtapose that with atomistic reductionism. So the concept of atomistic reductionism is essentially that everything can be reduced down, everything that's complex can be reduced down to its basic parts. So again, God is not a tangible thing, so he can't be reduced down. He's not real. Next is that man is only his biological parts, because he can be reduced down to them, and that's all that he is. And we call it atomistic reductionism because he's being reduced down to the atom, right? Everything can be reduced down to the atom. It's just carbon. And then the next thing is that truth then is whatever can be observed down to its smallest degree. Now let's look at nihilism. So nihilism is more of a philosophy rather than a study. Nihilism is the idea that nothing has any value whatsoever. It was made popular by, oh man, it escapes me. Who's nihilism made popular by? Nietzsche. There you go. Yeah. What? The Big Lebowski? So nihilism was made popular by a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche, and it's the idea that basically nothing matters. So in nihilism, God is either a hoax or is dead. He's not certain on God's existence, but he knows that whether God exists or not doesn't matter because God is powerless. So that's the idea. God is dead, and this, you may have heard that concept of God is dead. That's what that means. He's speaking specifically, well, actually, it's a little bit more complex. Anyway, let's move on. Man is alone. Man is alone and without meaning. And the last one is that truth cannot be known or isn't real. Fun tidbit, there is a urban legend that those people that took Nietzsche's first set of courses were known to kill themselves. So there you go. What you'll see is that in all of these cases, there is a similarity. There are similar traits in all of these cases. So let's go ahead, James, and talk about common traits.
So the common traits that all three of these examples have.
And that's just three of many examples, right. I just want to point out.
I thought that was made clear, but yes. So the common traits. There is a separation of observation, informed thought, and emotional intelligence as rational and irrational, and the creation of this fact-value split as a worldview. The belief that God does not exist in any type of objective reality. The belief that God is merely a construct to service the various needs of humans. We basically created him for utility purposes. The lack of any objective moral authority. Why do we take the moral stands that we do if there is no objective morality that guides us in that? The belief in the ultimate sovereignty of every human being. And a belief in the virtue of a free governing utopia. Give peace a chance. An active power of dynamic active power dynamic of oppressor and oppression and totalitarian authoritarianism. And I stumble on ontology. And I can say
Yeah, you can say that.
I don't know. Okay. They also, there's a borrowing of Judeo-Christian virtues to fill in the gaps of human decency in everyday relationships. You have to have somewhere to be able to explain these things, even though these things don't exist. Christianity explains them. We'll borrow from them to define those things that we say do not exist.
All right, let's move to the next slide.
Did you get your picture, Marianne? We can send you the information, too.
So, we've given you common traits. We're actually moving along at a great pace. I like it. So, red alert.
Joking his cats.
Unbelievable.
So we've given you common traits. You want to go back a slide?
That's 10 Hail Marys.
Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any questions about these common traits that are found in the premises that God is nothing and man is nothing?
Number 4, a lack of objective moral authority. A lack of?
Yeah.
Complete. There's zero, or there's just not?
Well, there's no standard.
There's no objective
There's nothing to base the standard on,
Yeah.
right? So moral authority lacks any authority.
Yeah.
It's whatever you decide that it's going to be at the moment.
Just curious about that. When you see Christians debate atheists, you'll pull, the atheists are filling the gap, so to say, pulling from, our belief system, to fill those gaps. And usually that's a morality issue. And you see that highlighted from Christian debaters, like, hey, you're pulling from our worldview, what's going on with that? So I was curious if there is like, I guess, morality within some of these premises, that you can, I don't know.
It's not objective.
No.
So there.
Yeah.
Go ahead, James.
Yeah. Just do you understand the use of the word objective, right? Objective versus subjective,
yeah.
right? Okay.
So yeah, it's not objective, and what you'll see is that a lot of people who have this particular premises at the heart of whatever nuanced viewpoint they have, whatever worldview they have, they can't actually operate with this. And that's the point that's being made, is that these worldviews are inoperable, right? You can't actually operate within them. They fall apart if you go too long in one direction.
Because they're so subjective.
Well, in the end, that's what ends up being.
That's the breakdown, right? When you don't have any type of cohesiveness in there because there's no set standard, then there's going to be a misstep where your standards either juxtapose against each other and completely cancel them out, or they just completely break down because you cannot carry them on as a standard because there is no standard. Yeah, we can take a look at world conflicts. I mean, that's probably the easiest way to look at how this plays out. I could pick on the Russia-Ukraine thing, but I'll go back to something a little more demonstrable in everybody's mind because it's so visceral. It invokes such an emotion, which is Nazi Germany. Okay, so we look back at Nazi Germany and you ask, what is the premises that their occupation of the world, essentially, is based upon? So, does anybody know where they're coming from in Nazi Germany? Your history tell you? Yeah, right? And so there's this idea that they are essentially better. Okay? So they've created an objective morality that is not founded in God, it's founded in them, right? And basically what they've done is they've reduced everything down to the sum of their parts and said, God doesn't exist, Germans exist, which is really ironic considering who Hitler was. But in any case, they've said God doesn't exist, Germans exist, Germans are the standard by which things happen, right? And so everything becomes about
a type of nationalism that's drawn out, right? And about genetics and so on and so forth. Well, what happens there is that then things don't make sense anymore in terms of the things that you would consider humanitarian or human decency. They don't make sense. So if somebody doesn't measure up to that standard, then treating your neighbor as if they're equal to you doesn't make sense anymore, right? Viewing somebody as if they're human beings doesn't make sense anymore because the parts that they're reduced down to are not just human parts, they're German parts, whatever that means. The list kind of goes on and on. And so what you see is that they're able to move the goalpost for human existence, right down to existence itself, right down to the value of a human being is able to be moved. And across the board, they're able to start to create atrocities within that framework because they have no actual objective standard. And it didn't start that way. It became that way as the philosophy deteriorated the system that it was meant to propagate. Like there was a reason why the German people voted Hitler into power. And that's because it was a working system in the beginning, but then over time, as it started to form and melanize into something that was tangible and had action behind it, it couldn't exist in the real world without becoming something heinous and atrocious. Most worldviews are not ever going to have that type of power behind them. And there's lots of reasons for why that is. But in any case, that's an example of what believing that you are reduced to the sum of your parts can do. And we look at that and we look at, for instance, the writings of Darwin, right? Darwin believed that we were the sum of our parts. He was a naturalist, and so he believed that we were the sum of our parts and that we evolved, and that process of evolution, which is defined essentially in terms of practice as survival of the fittest, is what gets us to evolve in a way that's most beneficial. Well, in survival of the fittest, what do?
Kill.
That's right. You kill.
Have to.
Right? You become the top of the food chain by becoming a predator in the food chain. And so you impose your will upon another creature. Again, what we're looking at here is that there's a diminishment of human value because basically you now are the standard. It's not the motherland or the fatherland or whatever it is. It's, in this case, you are the standard, and specifically your parts. So the parts that need to eat need food. The parts that need to reproduce need sex. The list goes on and on, right? And so what happens here is that we start reducing everything else in our world as usable parts to make us able to function in the world that we want to, but that actually makes us unable to function in a world with other human beings. Does that make sense? Any questions? There's kind of a lot there.
So when we talk about Darwinism, that's not an example of man is everything. That doesn't put man.
So again, you're leaning into something that we'll get into. But yeah, I mean,
it's hard not to.
If we'll pull back the curtain, the basic thing to understand as you synthesize these three premises and you understand what they are is that they're Ouroboros, right? They're all the snake eating its tail. Because if man is everything, then the value of everything becomes meaningless. And so then you could say that man is nothing. And so therefore, if man is everything, then man is nothing, and nothing is everything, so that means man is nothing. And the same thing is true of God, right? So basically what you have is these systems start to slowly become the opposite of what they were intended to be. So yes, that is the case. But we try to look at them separately because that's where people are coming from. if a person was to follow their thought process through, that's eventually what would happen. If a person could make their system function long enough for them to actually evolve their thought process, then a person who starts with man is everything would eventually come to the conclusion that man is nothing. And the opposite is true, that when they find that man is everything, then they would eventually come, wait, I said that.
You said
that man
it's
is nothing,
nothing.
They would eventually come to the conclusion that that nothing is everything. Which is what nihilism is, right? Everything is nothing, nothing is everything. All right, any questions?
Your head's physically spinning right now, Brian.
That's right. Well, what really gets strange is when you go into like the 1960s and you look at like some of the writings in the culture. Like if you guys ever get a chance, check out Francis Schaeffer's works, where he talks about worldview and how it evolved, and talking about how truth became subjective, and we now live in a post-truth society. And you start looking at the arts, and you can see how that works. Like, you know, what we're talking about, it sounds all confusing, but it's literally like the stuff that was presented like in the Beatles writings, for instance, like I am you and you are me and we are whatever. We are all together, and I am the walrus, cuckoo, cuckoo. You know, like that's what's being expressed here. So this is in popular culture.
Due to Eastern influence.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Which is God is everything. We'll get to that next time. Okay. Any more questions on the common traits before we start kind of attacking them? Because that's what we're going to do next.
Yeah, so our next step is to take each of those common traits that we've listed and then list out an actual response to those specific traits. So, but we want to make sure that there's an understanding of them before we get to the response to them.
Mm-hmm.
From what I can see of people, I don't see any questions.
So the only other thing I'd say before we move on is that what you're seeing from point 1 to 8 is kind of a ladder. Okay, so what you're seeing is a thought process that starts with 1 and eventually evolves down to number 7 and 8. And so you can see that when we talk about oppressor and oppression, and we talk about like Darwinism. That's a really good example of, at the end of the day, why wouldn't you oppress your neighbor? Like, why wouldn't you? It makes sense to. There was a debate. I think it was who was it? I can't remember who it was, but I know on the dissenting side it was Dawkins, Richard Dawkins. And to his credit, his foolishness, but his credit, he was asked about Nazi Germany and specifically the crimes that they were committing. And his response to that was essentially, yes, to be consistent with his belief system that there is no God, he has to admit that what they did was not wrong, that it was fine. In fact, it was good. And that's kind of where this like gets you when you follow the thought process through. It's not even wrong for us to destroy our neighbor, which of course runs completely counterintuitive to the Christian ethic, right? Which is that we love our neighbor, we pray for our enemies, but it is actually the opposite if you're to follow this process through, because your neighbor is basically only there to be used by you.
Didn't Darwin, when confronted, right, say that even morals evolved in some weird way to human beings?
Yeah, so...
You know,
mm-hmm.
Which really complicates.
Well, so we're not talking... So yes, Darwin had that idea. There's a lot of influence going back and forth between 3 or 4 guys in that period. Specifically, if you go back to the writings of John Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau, if you look at those guys, you look at Darwin, so on and so forth, everyone's batting around these ideas, but basically there's an idea of what we call social contract theory that is present in that time period. And Yeah, there's an idea that society basically only forms for the good of the individual, and that we built an idea of working together because it benefited us and us alone, and that it's good for us to keep going. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for us to continue. What I will say about that, because I don't think it's in the next part.
Oh, please.
But what I will say about that is that's an interesting idea, but it doesn't play out because that's just not what you see, right? What you see is societies tearing each other apart for the sake, like essentially if that was true, then what we would have is utopia. But that's never happened because that's not true. People, the idea of communism, socialism, like this idea that these like kind of great ideas that we can evolve into being a utopia, they just don't factor in human nature. They just don't. What am I thinking? Animal Farm?
Yeah.
Yeah, or one of my favorites, William Golding's.
George Orwell.
Yes, one of my favorites is William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Right, it's like things naturally degrade. It's like a relational second law of thermodynamics with like entropy, even though that's not speaking of. That's not about relationships, but there's an interesting premise for it. Now, of course, society. A godless society needs to explain the idea that we can all love each other and work together for the benefit of each other, but it can't explain that we constantly fall apart. However, Christianity does it really well. So I like to lean on the side of Occam's razor and say, well, the easiest solution is probably the right one. Anyway, let's go ahead and explore these topics.
So firstly, a separation of observation, informed thought, and emotional intelligence as rational and irrational, and the creation of a fact-value split in worldview.
That was point one. That was the common trait point one. Good.
All right. So the response to that is that the Bible reveals to us that humans are necessarily existing as a combination of physical and emotional personhood. It's a holistic worldview, must marry these two and not separate them. There cannot be a separation of these things.
So, common trait one is that when somebody has these premises, they automatically want to separate rational from, they automatically want to separate emotional intelligence, like observation and emotion, basically. And they create these divides, rational and irrational, or so on and so forth. Some of us went to a speaking engagement with Nancy Percy last night, and she expounded upon Francis Schaeffer's concept of the two stories, right? Of what we call a fact-value split, where you have the two stories never touching each other. There's the facts and the way that we work things out. Well, this is another way of talking about worldview, right? And so what happens when you're looking at this particular premises, which you're going to see in the other one too, but is that there's an automatic split between them, whether it's what would it be? The material world and the spiritual world, or our intimate relationships versus our work relationships, or whatever it be. Body versus mind. Whatever it is, these things are not holistic.
Emotional affair versus physical affair.
Yes. These things are not entangled necessarily together in a God is nothing worldview. Okay? But that's not what Christ teaches us, and it's not how humans operate. That's why it is that the same people who say that that's why it is that the same people who operate from we are nothing more than the sum of our parts worldview and say that a baby, for instance, is not a baby. It's just something growing in the mother, right? It's a clump of cells growing in the mother. That's why those same people argue that rape is inappropriate. It's heinous to rape somebody. Why? Why is it heinous to rape somebody? There's no actual value to people, so why is it heinous?
That's when they steal from our worldview.
That's right?
Then this creation of morality from somewhere.
Right, emotion.
It's not backed up.
Emotion is what's driving their sense of morality there, because they know that something's wrong, so they're stealing from a Christian worldview that provides them the idea that sexuality is something that matters, right? But it's not convenient. A child's not convenient. They don't have to face that child's death in that way. In fact, we do everything to remove the facing of that child's death, straight down to not defining them as a child, right? We don't call it a person, a baby, we call it a fetus, because we don't speak Latin, we speak English.
And we compare pictures of fetuses with fetus from other species and point out the similarities in them to show that, we're all just the same as that. So it's not really a person.
What were you going to say?
One of my favorite examples is the idea of marriage. That people value marriage even though
it's great.
Literally they don't keep it, they don't actually care about it, but they know deep down that it's something that's important. And it completely came from Christianity.
Right. Well, we value marriage. We value marriage in this society still, for whatever reason. But then we also think that cheating is wrong. Why? Now, this is not to say that as Christians we don't understand. In fact, as Christians we completely understand these things, because our worldview allows us to define morality holistically, to entangle rational thought with emotional thought. But in a viewpoint that says that we are nothing but the sum of our parts, then there's no such thing as emotional thought or rational thought. A rock is just a rock, and when we get into a conflict, it's just a rock hitting another rock. So, of course, human beings can't operate that way, because human beings are not just that. But it doesn't make sense. So when we first see that, we have to remember that that's not biblical. That there needs to be a space that is safe to cultivate the physical and emotional entanglement of our person. That's supposed to happen, the physical and emotional side. Yes?
How do they explain the fact then that people have consciences and we're the only animals on this earth that have a conscience? If they're just looking at us as the sum of our parts.
Well, they call it evolution, but they can't explain it. And some people would just doubt it completely. There's no evidence of it.
There's no evidence that we have a conscience?
Right, because your conscience, again, as a German soldier, gung-ho in the 1930s and 40s, is different than your conscience now, right? So conscience is subjective depending on the culture that you come from. It's actually a logical fallacy. What is it called? But anyway, they would say that it's malleable, basically.
But a conscience is not necessarily your actions. I mean, you may act not according to the good things that your conscience is trying to tell you to do, just like the German soldiers, or what's going on right now in Ukraine. They're like a lot of the Russian soldiers don't even want to be there, yet they're being ordered to do these atrocities.
Right. Okay, so let me tell you how I would explain that from psychology, from a secular worldview. Okay, so in psychology we have and this is kind of getting tangential, but we have the ego and we have the superego and the id, right? And so this is how our brain is sort of wired and separated. So basically, when your conscience produces guilt feelings, it's because the superego, which is interacting, and it's funny because this came out of Germany, the superego is interacting with too many inputs from other things. And so in order for you not to feel the guilt of oppression not to feel the guilt which is caused by oppression, you have to throw off those things. You have to throw off the shackles of oppression being caused by your interaction with certain institutions, right? Because you're not actually guilty because you can't be guilty because there's no guilt in a creature that has no defining morality. So basically, what you're feeling in those moments that you call conscience is just guilt feelings. And so you actually need to be okay with whatever you are doing. If you want to kill somebody, you should kill somebody. In fact, it's good for you to kill somebody if you want to, because as long as it gets you forward. So those soldiers who have a conscience from a secular worldview, from a secular psychology standpoint, from Freudian psychology essentially, which psychology is not monolithic, there's other ways of looking at it, but that being said, those soldiers who have a conscience about it are soldiers whose superego is out of control and needs to be unshackled so that their id can take control. That's how I would view it from a secular standpoint. And that's, basically what a simple way to say that would be, if you feel guilty about what you're doing, you have been brainwashed. That would be how it would be. And think about that when you think about like a cult, right? Like as people's values start to change within a cult system, what's being said to them from the outside is that they were brainwashed into not being able to use their conscience. What's being said to them from the inside is that they're being brainwashed from the people outside. So
indoctrinated.
Right. So who's right? That's the question. Who is right? Well, the scripture tells us that we are made in the image of God and that we are to be holistic and that our emotional and our physical and our intellectual side are supposed to be entangled and coexist. So what I would say to you is that if one of these different groups is imposing itself upon you at the cost of your other areas of development, those groups are probably wrong. And one of the detriments about Christianity is that people have used Christianity over time. We'll get into this when we get into God is other, but people have used Christianity over time to as basically a power measure by doing just that, by getting rid of the body's connection to the spirit and the connection to the intellect, or vice versa. When we look at the early proto-Gnostic writings that the Apostle John and the Apostle Paul were dealing with, when we look at Colossians, when we look at 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, when we look at the book of John, when we look at these Christian writings that are dealing with proto-Gnosticism, the main thing they're dealing with there is that everybody absolutely accepted that Jesus was God. When he rose from the dead, it's pretty obvious. But what happened was they were having a hard time accepting the body. And this is why they were like, yeah, he's obviously God, but he probably wasn't actually human. And this is the reason why John says that the measure for whether somebody is really a follower of Christ is whether they accept the body, the historicity of Christ. What's being said there is that there's an entanglement between humans, their soul and their spirit and their body and their intellect and all of these things that need to be there. And Christ is the perfect entanglement for those things. That's kind of tangential, kind of got off track. But yeah, that's point one. Yes, Heidi.
My mind flips. So when they make a separation, they are diminishing at least one of those sides, right?
Yes. And I'll just add that separation doesn't mean a lack of submission. There should be submission within that, just as we see within the Trinity, that there's a submission structure that's there, but they have equal value and they shouldn't be separated from each other. And this is one, you want to know the reason why we have so much issues with sexuality and gender identity and all these things? It's because popular Christianity has tried to be righteous at the cost of separating the body from the spirit, right? Everything the flesh does is wrong, right? Sex is bad. That's been the message of popular Christianity from the 1950s all the way into the late 80s. So what happened? People rallied against it, right? Sexual revolution. And they were right to, because that message was wrong. Now, they weren't right in the way they did it, and they weren't right in the conclusion they came to. That's also Christianity's fault. Let's move forward.
Point 2. The belief that God does not exist in objective reality. The response: a personal, infinite God is not only a fact, but he is a necessary fact in the existence of beings who are both constrained by a finite physicality, but express a need for intangible relationship. Without his presence, the juxtaposition of a finite being who long to be with each other beyond their constraints makes absolutely no sense.
This is a really simple point said really with too many words. That's how you know I wrote it. It's a really simple point. They think, based on the premises, there is no God, basically. God is nothing. They think that then they think that he can't exist in reality, right? But how can you even come up with that concept without him existing? It's a very simple thing. That doesn't work with some things, right? That doesn't work with, I imagine a flying saucer, or like this, right? That doesn't mean that thing necessarily exists now, right? But we're not talking about finite objects, we're talking about infinite. We're talking about something that cannot be imagined. If it cannot be imagined, yet we imagine it, then it must be bigger than our imaginations. That's just philosophically true.
Intangible became tangible.
It would have the intangible would have to be tangible in order for us to understand the intangible's existence, because we can't comprehend the intangible. So it's simple, it's a little bit difficult because it's philosophical, but yeah. And then when you go on and you understand that, basically what's being said is that man is derivative, and it's necessary for God to exist, for man to be derivative. In other words, a child pops into the world, and they have an understanding of their presence, and they have an understanding of their limbs, and they have an understanding of their thought process. And that child automatically wants to know what?
Why?
Yeah, where did I come from? Like, why am I here? Where am I going? Like, what is my existence, right? Why? Why does a child think that? A rock doesn't think that, not as far as we know. Why does a child think that? Because their very existence is evidence that they came from something. That's why.
Another way to think about it, the children did an interesting exercise a number of years ago where they made up their own animals. In making up their own animals, though, the only way to describe those animals was to describe them by animals that already exist. Mm-hmm. They could not create an animal without saying, well, it has a neck like a giraffe. They can't just describe a long neck animal without pointing to something that already clearly exists, that is tangible, that you can see in order to describe it. So there's no way to come up with an idea of God without God being there for you to have the idea that God exists.
Mm-hmm. And this is the reason why God presents himself the way that he does in Scripture, where he presents himself in multiple facets. Other gods of other cultures will present themselves as a singular facet, like the god of lightning, thunder, or like all these different things, right? But the first way that God is expressed is, I am that I am. right? That there's nothing that I can define my existence by that you can understand. So basically, I am just what I am. And then you have all these other attributes that are applied to him specifically, that he is the healer, that he's the banner, that he's like all of these various things, these aspects, right? But his name is I am what I am, because he cannot be described by anything else. So how do we have a description of him? Necessarily, he has to exist. Just philosophically speaking, necessarily, he has to exist. Again, that is because we are dealing with something that aims to be infinite. If we were dealing with something that was finite, it wouldn't necessarily have to exist. But again, you would describe it in a finite way. God is a giraffe, right? Let me carve him out of stone so you can see him and worship him. But the God of the Bible is not that and cannot be described that way. And therefore, he's probably the actual only philosophical thing that can actually exist that way.
Any further questions on that before we move on?
This was in reference to the second common trait?
Yeah.
What was the second?
The belief that God does not exist in objective reality. It really comes down to, if you really want to sum it up, it's that statement, objective reality, right? If you believe in an objective reality, then you're saying that there's a standard. So if you say that God can't exist in reality, you might be right, although you'd be terribly wrong. But that being said, if there is a reality, then God must exist, because definitionally there has to be something in that reality that is bigger than the biggest thing that you can understand in reality, which is you. Right? You're like, you could say you're a brain in a jar floating around, and that everything's a simulation. But the one thing you would know is you. And you are personal. You are relational. Like, you long for relationship. Just the idea that we want to express things and put them into words. Even the crotchety old guy that doesn't want to talk to anybody. You still want to express things. And you're still an expressive, creative creature in all of these ways. You're an enactor in reality. That's not possible unless there's something that defines reality. And it would if that is the case, if it's objective, if it's a standard for reality, then there must be something that is everything that you are to infinity. Which means God must exist, and he must be personal, he must be relational, he must be everything that we are to the ideal to infinity. Otherwise, there is no such thing as morality or anything like that. And you can get there when you talk about the paradox, the truth paradox, right? Where somebody says there's no such thing as objective reality, there's no such thing as truth. And what are they doing in that moment? That's a self-refuting argument, right? Because they're saying that there is a truth. Right? No such thing as truth. You are now saying that there is a truth. Therefore, you have refuted yourself. Therefore, truth must by nature exist. God, by nature of being this infinite being in connection to finite beings who are this, and this, must exist. He just has to be logically consistent, which is fine if you're not interested in being logically consistent. But then you can't claim that there's a standard. That's where it comes down to.
All right. Are we on to 3? So the third one was the belief that God is a construct to service the various needs of humans. The Bible reveals that humans were put here for God's glory and will. Beyond this, because the fact of his being as the God, he cannot continue to be God and be in need. Conversely, any human who constructs a God cannot rightfully believe it to be a God, since they are, by definition, its creator and sustainer. Thus, they would be the God. They are the God of their own idol. Creating such idols doesn't truly serve humans. It merely demonstrates their lack of control, as they are bound to serving it. Therefore, these gods do not serve their needs.
I mean, that one seems pretty obvious to me. Does anybody need clarification on that point?
Tiffany?
Dead air, speak up.
No?
No? Okay.
Do people do this when I see they are the god of their own idol, creating such idols doesn't truly serve humans? I mean, I think of people, I don't know a specific religion, but creating a religion with a god in order to serve whatever they're after.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's usually a need that they want to have fulfilled, something that they can't do in and of themselves. I had a couple of employees when I was a manager of Burger King many moons ago, and when I went to visit them at their house for another matter, I came into their house, and on the wall they had a huge picture of a gentleman, and they said, "Do you know who this person is?" And I said, "No." And they said, "We believe that he is God." I said, "Well, why do you believe that he is God?" "Because he will provide these things for us that we do not have. He has achieved these things, therefore he is our God, because then we can achieve those things because he has achieved those things." Mm-hmm. But this person didn't actually exist. They created this person as the ideal of what it is that they could achieve, and it became an idol for what they wished to achieve in and of themselves that they could not achieve. They were the masters of that God.
I mean, what's driving that, right? Like a pride thing, lack of ability
That
to
could,
humble themselves before
right.
God, like, true God.
Yep.
And so they design and construct.
Yep.
Something that's more malleable and controllable and
Yep.
fits specific needs that they don't want to give up.
That can't hold them accountable, right? It goes back to Romans 1, right? So they knew who God was, but not wanting to acknowledge God as God, they oppressed him, right? They
oppressed the truth of who God was and made up God in their own image.
That's right. And seeking to become wise, they become utter fools, and their minds become clouded, right? Cloudy. And the term there for suppressing the knowledge of who God is means to take and hold underwater. So it's not that they don't know who God is, but they refuse to worship him as God. And why do they do that? Because they want to be God.
So inherently, intrinsically, within our DNA, we value knowing God, experiencing God, glorifying God, willing God. But then their thoughts and actions are conflicting with that.
Yeah, the sinful nature.
Huh?
Sinful nature is conflicting with it.
Yeah.
That's how Paul describes it, is our sin nature. It doesn't want that, right? There's some interesting studies that are done. I wish I had the stats on it. But there have been a couple studies that are done with children and their knowledge of God, where they, essentially it's been proven that they start off believing in God, and that belief has to be outmoded over time. Children naturally assume the existence of God. They're geared toward seeing something more. This concept is probably best applied for us in a non-God environment where it comes to money. Like that's probably the best place it's applied, because what you have is you've got people working for this thing. They eat, sleep, and drink it just to get more of it, right? To the point where now it rules every aspect of their life. They claim they want it because it gives them freedom to do whatever they want to. This is a completely secular concept, this concept of greed, right? It's a completely secular concept. We even say, what was it? It was in the 80s, like greed is good, right? What's Michael Douglas? Wall Street, greed is good. And that was like a big thing, the greed generation in the 1980s. That's a secular thing. These people, they're not even thinking about God, any of that, right? But they are thinking about stepping over the person next to them to get higher up to get this thing, right? To the point where they're destroying relationships. They're destroying even simple things about their health, like all of these things. That's an idol. It's an idol. It's an idol where now they are in service to it. Yes?
So what I'm understanding is that, what is it called? The way we were created is to serve God, so any need we have derived in the future cannot be fulfilled unless we are following God. That's what I understand being said. Is that correct?
Cannot be fulfilled. Yes, cannot be fulfilled. It can be, let's call it satiated. Like our hunger can be satiated by sort of trying to fill it with other things. That's literally what you have. Again, that is the sensation of it's not enough. You know, I got this promotion, but it's not enough. I need more. You know, I scored over the weekend with this chick, but it's not enough. I need more. It's all of these things, these little cultures that we developed are a form of idol worship where we are satiating the itch, but not dealing with the infection. Which is what...
Straight greed and power?
Sorry?
Isn't it straight greed and power?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what it becomes, right? That's you can boil it down to that, but then let's boil it down further and say that it's idol worship, right? It's an issue of worship.
Pride.
Yeah.
It's a pride issue.
Yeah. It's, Christ would call it lust, right? Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. Those are the three areas.
Think of the Tower of Babel, makes me think of that
Mm-hmm.
in America.
Well, that's what America is. It's a tower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even up into the heavens. Fourth premise, a lack of objective moral authority. Now, the Bible reveals that God is the author of objective reality. Without him, there is no truth. The idea that there is no moral reality is easily refuted because it is self-refuting fallacy. If this fallacy were true, then there is nothing objectively wrong or evil, including ideas such as there is an objective truth. This also applies to the social relationships as well. The idea that certain heinous crimes are wrong or evil becomes irrational and a matter of irrational preference by this logic. The reality of living in a free for all of thought and action is generally unattainable for any society to function for very long. In a free-for-all. There we go. Phrasing.
So this goes back again to that concept of objective truth, right? And basically what we have here is that with a lack of objective moral authority, you have the degradation of society. And we always talk about the negative side, then things that are that seem with a Christian consensus to be objectively negative are meaningless. You know, like I like to watch Law and Order in the mornings when I'm working out, and and you have SVU, right? SVU has been on like 22 years. Think about that. Longer than any of the Law and Order shows. Special Victims Unit, which deals with heinous crimes. Why? Why are we fascinated with that? Because we know innately that it's different. So it doesn't have a meaning without the idea that there is an objective morality. You can't say that something's wrong if you don't think there's any such thing as wrong. I was going to say something else. Let's see. Oh, yeah. What I was going to say is the other side that's very rarely talked about is beauty. Without an objective morality, there's no such thing as beauty. And so what ends up happening is that there's a low bar for critique that's given. And now, without the high bar to say this is like objectively beautiful, then what you get is a bunch of things that are not beautiful being called beautiful. And we see that in our society. We see all sorts of things being called brave that aren't brave. We see all sorts of things being called beautiful that are weird and bizarre. We see all sorts of artwork that at one point were being viewed as objectively negative, but we move closer and closer to like straight up fine art, being just gross. Makes us feel weird, but nobody can say it because they can't call something real. If you can't call something true, then you can't say that there's something wrong with it. So it's on both sides. It's on the negative side with things that are sad, like, no, you cannot rape my daughter. Why not? If I was living in Sodom, it might be different, right? And is that wrong? I mean, for Dawkins, it wasn't wrong in Germany. Is it just not wrong because I don't live in Sodom? On the other side, I can't say that that marriage is beautiful, or that that a love between a man and a woman is beautiful. Because if I say that, then I might be oppressing somebody or something. So now the standard of all reality is just kind of out the door. So that's what we lose when we give to the idea that there's no objective morality.
We're literally to the point where we can't celebrate any of our own personal accomplishments, because then we're oppressing somebody because they haven't accomplished the same things we have. Yeah. The biggest fight happening on a regular basis on most of the the mainstream media and in what's it called? The apps
YouTube.
And stuff. No, the apps and stuff. The thing. Social.
Yeah.
Steel trap.
We did it.
It just wouldn't open. Social media is people coming out as fat phobic by saying merely that, if I come out and say, well, I've done these exercises to help to lose my weight, well, I'm fat phobic and I'm oppressing fat people because I've been brainwashed into thinking that the only way to be healthy is for me to be thin, and the only way to be thin is by exercising, and fat is beautiful. So I shouldn't be oppressing them. That's fat phobic. This is real.
Josh, when you were talking about the art, that's what Schaefer was talking about, right? Like nowadays, you throw a piece of feces at a canvas and it sells for $1 million.
Yep.
So it's redefining the definition of beauty.
Yep.
To almost to the point now where we're seeing it glamorized.
Oh yeah.
Unless it's showing violence and sexual depictions and things like that.
Yep.
Then it's no good.
Especially in the area of things like video games.
Okay.
There's some crazy stuff out there with technology. It's to the point where you look at something like pornography, for instance. And I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a violent debate in pornography over the idea of something called deep fakes. Because basically, with computer technology, they've been able to take people's faces and seamlessly insert them on top of other people's bodies without it you've seen, we've all seen movies where they've de-aged people and things like that, right? Well, they've been able to do this, and now this is going over porn stars, right? To make anybody to make actresses and actors into porn stars, right? And so now this smut industry, which in the past has been seen as sort of the pinnacle of degradation in society, is now fighting against this new industry that's arisen that is trying to, that basically is blurring the line of what like they're taking it further, basically, than the porn industry did. Because the porn industry wants to say, this is beautiful, and this is okay, and that we're sexually affirming, and all these sorts of things. And now a new technology has come along that threatens their jobs, because their God is money. It's not sex, like you might think. Their God is money. And so there's a fight that's going on for the definition of what's acceptable as art, right? Is this just artistic, or is this exploitation? That's happening within a fringe depth industry. It's not really fringe because it's like one of the giant, it makes more money than anything, but fringe in terms of morality. On the outskirts of morality, there's a fight happening to keep it from being defined even further less than beautiful. And that's really like profound, and like that's where we're headed in society, where basically there is no meaning, there is no reality, there's no understanding of what's real, what's not. And yeah, my boy Schaeffer absolutely 100% predicted it. And he talked about, one of the things that he talks about, which I thought was just interesting, especially as being a musician, was he said that the beginning of the downfall of our understanding of high critique and art and beauty is when we were able to record it. Like the moment that there was a recording of a human voice, the moment there was photography, that was the moment when the value of beauty was diminished. That's pretty interesting. And we live in a day and age where that stuff is readily available to us, but most of humans didn't. And right now we're like, oh, it's so terrible, I missed this photo, or I didn't get this video. Most humans never got that chance. It's real interesting. It's real interesting in terms of like what's beauty and what's not. And yeah, Schaeffer predicted it, and this is where we're at, where we don't have an objective standard for anything.
If you want a safe way to see what Josh is talking about, but don't want to end up with weird search histories, you can search for Tom Cruise.
Oh my gosh. Yes. That is so bizarre.
So there's a new one where he's cleaning a kitchen, like an industrial kitchen, and using the Gojo orange cleaner. It's interesting.
So yeah, there's these guys who do deep fakes comedian ones are funny too, where they do like Bill Hader. There's Bill Hader deep fakes because he's a really good impressionist. And so he'll be like doing like a talk show thing, and he'll like impersonate people's voices, and then they'll deep fake that person onto his like face while he's doing it, and then he'll switch back out to regular. There's another deep fake that was real interesting, which was Robert Downey Jr. and Tom Holland as Marty and Doc in Back to the Future, where they digitally inserted their faces over Marty and Doc in Back to the Future, and it's cool. But yeah, it also means there's no objective reality. It's scary. There's a Barack Obama one that Jordan Peele did, right? Wasn't that Jordan Peele?
Yes.
There's a Barack Obama one where he talks about where it's Barack Obama like saying ridiculous things. And he talks about like the scariness of where we're headed as a culture with art. And then the screen moves to the side and you see it's actually Jordan Peele, and he's like impersonating Barack Obama. But they've deep faked him to show that like you can't trust. Well, what are they saying? You can't trust anything anymore.
What you see and what you hear may not be reality.
A lack of objective authority. There's no moral authority to say that anything is good or evil. That's what that leads to.
Number 5. The belief in the ultimate sovereignty of every human being. Humans may like the idea that they are individually sovereign, but this creates a lack of objectivity for reality and actions. You can see the answer above.
That would be the point we just talked about.
This often turns into a launching point for a competition of the strongest to create a structure by which society can function. After all, nobody can make decisions that have zero impact upon the decisions of those around them. This is because humans are finite. Their reach is limited in scope, and can only be reasonably applied effectively in a very narrow sense. The Bible, of course, responds to this by pointing out that only a limitless, sovereign God can determine boundaries in action that will be of ultimate benefit.
If nothing is real, then the only thing that matters is what you do. It's the only thing you can depend on, right? Can't depend on my spouse. She might leave me. Don't even know if she loves me, right? Can't depend on my money because a pandemic might hit.
Or my country may go to war and my money may have no value anymore.
Yeah. Tomorrow I might be Ukrainian and tomorrow I wake up Russian.
You had something, John?
I was just going to say, it's interesting because you have like a constitution that has tons of amendments to it, but you have the commandments that don't have any,
Yeah. Well, that's why God gives us revelation. Yeah. What are you going to say, Brian? Nothing?
No, that's just an interesting point. You're saying with the amendments, it's like watering it down?
Yeah,
Well, things change.
It's changing to meet with times.
Yeah.
Right, so we're redefining what was originally purpose for, I guess it's not.
Some are better, some are not,
Yeah.
but things change.
Some things change. Most things change. But where Scripture is clear, they don't. And that's one of the interesting things. There's nuances that change, but premises are still there. And when we study what Scripture is, we study its transmission, and we study what we call the infallibility of Scripture. We study its transmission. What we see is that Scripture somehow defies that law, and we've been able to. It's a strange book. Strange book. So nuances change, but there's also nothing new under the sun, and I think that that's true. I think that the application might be nuanced and different as generations go on, but the struggles of humanity are the same. The temptations are the same, and the applications are just changed by our technological advancement. What this comes down to is if you can't trust anything, you can't trust the standard, then the only thing that matters is what you do, and it's the only thing you can trust, and that leads people to the breakdown of society. It's basically it, And this country in particular, I swear it feels like we're at the edge of civil war like every 2 years, and it's getting worse and worse. Why is that? Because there is no moral standard. We used to have what we called a Christian consensus. Maybe not everybody was a Christian, but we basically understood things, right? Now, we can't even agree that a boy's a boy and a girl's a girl. And these are fundamental issues of nature. Can't even agree upon that. What makes us think we can run a country?
Anything else before we move on? I think that's pretty well covered. But
Thank the Lord.
all right, the sixth
Point.
common trait.
Yeah.
A belief in the virtue of a free governing utopia. As noted above, a free society cannot exist without a transcendent agent or standard. Though a small utopia for a small time may function, a true utopia will always become dystopian given enough time. The Bible tells us not to seek this utopia on this earth for that exact reason. It will never truly exist. History tells us that it never really has, and logic tells us that without God, it never truly will.
I'm really proud of that last sentence. So one common trait that you see is this concept of utopia. My favorite version of that is Star Trek. Okay? That's my favorite version. Gene Roddenberry's idea, which was profound. It came at the right time. It was the 1960s, right? And everything was in flux the way it is now. And things are just vastly different since that point. And Gene Roddenberry came in at the right time and gave the mass public through the media of television, which was fairly new. It was fairly in its infancy at that time. And color television on top of it, which was also fairly new. That's why they had these primary colors that really stood out. He really drew this idea of utopia, that man can be together and that there's no conflict. The conflict that we have is with other species who we just want to be friends with. And that's a profound idea. And he like demonstrated things that we had never seen before on television, at least in a positive way, right? There was the first interracial kiss. There was crew members of all varying ethnicities. I mean, it's not true that Chekhov, who's the Russian pilot, he was put there because of the Beatles and because the Russians were angry and they wanted, like, people, they were the first ones in space and they wanted, that represented. And then the producers were like, well, we really want somebody who's like young and like, that's why he has that terrible haircut, because that was the Beatles' haircut. In any case, that's utopia. Anybody watch Star Trek now? No? Federation, I'm going to give you spoilers, okay? The concept of the Federation as it was doesn't exist anymore. Everything in Star Trek right now is geared toward the idea that the Federation has become dystopian. So this idea that Gene Roddenberry had that fueled the imagination of even our scientists, where like all of our technology like looks like it came from Star Trek. We have like the very first space shuttle, the Enterprise, is named after the ship. Like all of those nerds who grew up that way and like built things, like that's not what it is anymore. It's all dystopian now. It's all that there's all the hidden things that are going on behind the scenes and so on and so forth. Even our secular people don't believe it. We are to not believe it. And when somebody comes along and says, I can unify the world under one godless rule, watch out. Hopefully he doesn't have a Charlie Chaplin mustache.
One godless rule, what if he comes and says, I can unify the world under God, right?
Yeah.
Is that what we're looking for?
No.
That's
Definitely
actually-
not.
That's actually how it's supposed to come, something we believe, not something we don't
That's going to
believe.
give us signs and wonders and...
Here's what's going to happen.
Right.
So when you're talking about signs and wonders, you're talking about like all of it, discourse, Thessalonians, Revelation. When we're talking about those things and we're talking about who's going to come, God doesn't factor into that equation. That character that you're talking about, that John predicts and Paul predicts, the man of lawlessness in Thessalonians, the colloquially called Antichrist, though never actually referred to as the Antichrist, the beast out of the earth in Revelation, that character says that he's God.
Right, yeah, I guess that's what I meant.
Right? He lifts himself up, goes into the temple, and sets himself up as the abomination of desolation. That's what the book of Daniel calls it. That's what Revelation calls it. And in that, he is blaspheming God, right? And we've seen a couple characters in history who've kind of worked this way. Probably the one that stands out the most is a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, and he actually went into the temple. I think he put a boar's head in the temple.
He put a severed boar's head.
Yeah, but he declared himself to be God. So if you see something, what you're probably going to see is not under God. You're probably going to see somebody who's declaring themselves to be God. But the scripture is also really clear that we're not to fall for that either. Because when Christ returns, which is the only person that we're supposed to fall on our knees for in absolute sovereignty, it says everyone will know it. It says, people will say, he's here, he's there. Don't go looking. Don't even follow them, because everyone will know it. So, yeah, I'm sure he'll send out a tweet or something.
Yeah.
Got to make sure it's the official. It's got to have the blue.
The official, the real Jesus Christ.
Yes.
So why exactly should we have believed Jesus when he came here the first time?
That is a completely different... That's funny. That belongs in a different conversation, but ask it again.
Why should we have believed Jesus when he came here the first time?
because the evidence shows that he was right.
Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophecies from the God that defined himself by himself, that showed the interaction that he wanted to have, and he met every single one of those prophecies to a T that came, hundreds and hundreds of years before him. So Jesus is clearly the one who was talked about by that. These things, of course, have been collected for us in what we call the Bible. But the scrolls that the Israelites were the keepers of, the chosen people of God, faithfully took those things down, and those things have proven themselves to be true. So since the proof has been provided, and it doesn't detract from, in any way, shape, or form, from what the truth is, then it's the only thing that can be believed.
Yeah, it is the most reasonable thing to believe in the authenticity and historicity of Jesus. He is the most well-attested figure in the course of ancient history, and strangely the most well-attested figure even now. Some people have tried to diminish him and say that that he's just a mythological figure that's affected society akin to somebody like Luke Skywalker, right? But the truth is that that's just not the case. There's an interesting book by a guy named J. Warner Wallace. He's known for another book called Cold Case Detective, or Cold Case Christian, I think. But he posits a really interesting idea, and I think it makes sense, which is that if you were to remove the scriptures, you would still have, like if you were to ban it, right? You would still have the complete gospels in the banning of the scriptures, because Christ is so prevalent that even his critics cannot help but tell his story. And so basically, like, people work so hard against Jesus, not just the people who work for Jesus, which is profound in culture. Good book to read, which if you're a part of the Eldership Academy, you either will be or have read, the book that made your world, which talks about how the Bible and the message of the gospel basically formed the world as we know it in a profound way that is, like, you just can't separate it from that. You can't do an alternate history where Jesus showed up 2,000 years later, and what would that be like, and still have it look like today, because that just doesn't make sense. But what a profound idea that Christ is so influential in history that he literally cannot be removed from it. Even if you were to remove the positive messages, the negative messages would still paint the picture. And that is the truth. It's not the truth of Santa Claus or Luke Skywalker, but it is the truth about Christ. That's what's interesting about him. There is no other person in the history of the world who has had more of a profound effect and who has more attestation in that way than anybody else. The proof of Christ in history that even by his apostles, it's the best attested fact. It's more true in terms of evidence than the existence of Julius Caesar. There's only 7 works in antiquity that attest to the historicity of Julius Caesar. 7. There's thousands of works about Christ, and yet we wouldn't bat an eye to say that Julius Caesar existed. But we're like, Jesus, he may not have been real. Come on. Yeah.
So are there Gentile historians from that time that have written that they had seen Jesus after he resurrected?
I don't know.
I mean, that's...
I don't know about Gentiles.
I don't know.
His own, disciples.
We do have...
Well,
we do have Jewish historians who are not Christians.
Persecutors, yeah.
Yeah, persecutors. You can look to people like Josephus comes to mind. who is considered a Jewish historian and spoke and attested to the fact that Jesus existed, but is definitely never a Christian.
Right.
And is
Anti-Christian.
Yeah.
And then there's I can't remember his name, but he was a Roman historian.
Yeah.
I don't know if they saw Christ with their own eyes, because that's not the record, right? The record of Christianity was never that Christ went and marched into Rome and said, record this. It was that he appeared to his followers and that he taught them, and that's what happened. But what we do have is the attestation of martyrdom, and the fact that all of hundreds, maybe even thousands.
Like 500, I think.
Yeah, well, we have the attestation of martyrdom that these people died because they thought this was true. People who were verifiably his companions. All of these people thought it was true.
that were close enough to when he was here to be able to easily disprove that and not hold that belief to spare their lives.
500?
Yeah, well,
But it's
I don't remember the exact number.
Yeah.
Was it Tacitus?
That's the name that was coming to mind, but I didn't want to just throw out a Roman name because,
right. No,
other than that, they sound cool.
Tacitus.
Yeah, my favorite is that dude who helped write, like the King James is kind of based on Desiderius Erasmus. I love that name.
I literally just said that the other day in class because we went over that chapter.
Yes, I love that name. If I ever have another boy, it's Desiderius Erasmus McGary. Okay.
DRM. Okay. No, DER. Okay. We're on 7.
Almost there.
An active power dynamic of oppressor and oppression and totalitarian authoritarianism. I said it right the first time.
Yeah.
So without a proper standard or agent and growing amounts of unanswered needs, the only thing left to do is enact or to exact our will. Regardless of its effect on others, this will necessarily cause a dystopia, but it will also necessarily bring rise to bullies and dictators. This is the reason that people go to war. This truth has been, despite their lack of belief in God, as much as it has been with one. The Bible explains that this is the effect of sin, and it gives an answer and conclusion to this in Jesus and his impending universal kingship. A godless history promises a peace-filled and evolving decency of humans that has never produced nor could reasonably ever promise.
And this is just saying again that, when you allow a worldview premise that says there is no God to start off, eventually you become God in that equation. Somebody becomes God in that equation. Somebody needs to control the system. You gotta make sure there's enough food. You gotta make sure there's enough water, so on and so forth. And we see this best in communism, right? We can have the best of intentions, but over time, something has to control something else at the expense of what is below and of what's weaker. That'd be the best way to say it. So you see, and in communism, it's not a social system, it's an economic system. But that being said, it's a great example of how this plays out. It's just natural. It's just what happens. There's no difference between a system like that versus, a bully in a school versus the mafia versus whatever. When you have an equal playing field between individuals that is not actually equal, human beings, because of sin, like what you brought up, John, greed and power, they want to fill that vacuum. And why do they want to fill that vacuum? Well, the scripture says that it's made to be filled. We are made to submit. There is always supposed to be something that is in power. And so that is the case here. God is supposed to be in power, and we will never stop this until Christ returns and calls himself, king, even amongst his followers, right? Because amongst his followers, what you have is people who are arguing about the way in which they serve the king. So, yeah, it doesn't work.
This reminds me of the experiment they had up in Seattle last.
Oh, yeah.
Chaz or.
It didn't change names multiple times.
A couple of different times.
Yeah.
People started killing each other, and it was just, yeah, I mean, it's real sad.
Let's move on.
Yes.
Oh, you got something? No?
No.
Let's move on.
Number 8. The borrowing of Judeo-Christian values to fill the gaps of human decency in everyday relationships. As people living in this state with a need to be relational, but with a lack of ability to trust reality, they are ironically left with a single option. They must lean on the irrational and stomach the stress, guilt, and shame of being inconsistent. To escape the cognitive dissonance of it, of it all, they must create virtues that have no rational basis in reality. In the end, the very thing that they tried to escape by taking a reductionist relational view of the world leaves them irrational and living in the very type of faith that they were hoping to avoid. The Bible doesn't have this problem because it acknowledges that people are necessarily dependent beings.
I had this guy once that I was debating. He's an atheist. And when it came down to it, I asked him the question. I took it to an extreme, right? I asked him the question of, you are a sexual being. It's good for you to procreate. There are women here. You're obviously stronger than them. Why don't you just take them and procreate with them? And his response is, well, because, I care about them. And my response is, why? Why do you care about them? Because what's good in your world is, to propagate yourself. So why do you care about them? Beyond what beyond what benefits you. I mean, I can understand not wanting maybe, anyway. Well, no, you want children.
You want children.
Oh, if you're going to.
Yeah, although that doesn't make sense either. I've never understood that concept of
Why would you bring up the very thing that would compete with you?
Right, of propagating,
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Anyway, so that's all assuming that you don't just kill them and use them as a resource. Anyway, yeah. Cognitive dissonance is this concept of being sort of emotionally and mentally between a rock and a hard place, right? When that happens, we have to move. Otherwise, we sort of die. We get squished, right? So I tried to put him into cognitive dissonance by bringing it to his attention. And his response to me was, I can't explain it. It's just true. Right? I know this to be true. And the fact that you think that I should do these things based on the beliefs that I've put forward makes you immoral. That's what he was saying to me. That I didn't understand morality because I think based on his beliefs that he should be raping, killing, like all of these things, plundering, stealing. So he was saying, I didn't understand morality. What was he doing there? He was having faith, right? He was borrowing my belief system in order to justify what would make him comfortable. I don't want to kill. I don't want to steal. I don't want to do any of these things. Why? Because I like these people, because I love them, because I care about them. And so I can't justify that based on my belief. So what am I going to do? I'm going to borrow from yours. And I'm going to take something like love and significance of human beings and so on and so forth, and I'm going to apply it to them even though I have no right to apply it to them in my system. To the point where now he's being completely irrational. I don't understand love. And even though he's a thinker, he doesn't need to justify his thoughts. So now by his own standard, he's completely irrational. And that's okay for me, because I understand what's really going on, right? For me, I understand that he's a person made in the image of God who sees the image of God in another person and doesn't want to mar that or take advantage of it because he knows innately it's wrong, even if he is suppressing the knowledge of it and holding it down. So I can justify that and I can understand it. But in his world, it's irrational. That comes with consequence. That comes with consequence to him. It makes him have to live in guilt and shame. It makes him have to, it closes his world down so that he can't be open about his viewpoints unless he becomes completely irrational. Like, for instance, no longer recognizing gender, no longer recognizing the human life, so on and so forth. How can, and this same person is like completely pro-choice. So how does that make sense?
So,
It's even the concept of love. Like, why do you have?
Yeah, you have to borrow. Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yep. What are you going to say?
so to alleviate the pressure from the cognitive dissonance, right? Creating these other virtues, these virtues being like what we're seeing today with pro-choice, there's no gender, there's no sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like those kind of virtues? Like how does that manifest?
So a person, in order to alleviate the pressure from not calling God God,
Right.
essentially,
Right.
they have to borrow to get relationship. Relationship is how you usually alleviate pressures. You know, it's tend and befriend.
The relationship is.
Relationship is generally how you alleviate pressures.
So in order to get that relationship, they'll buy into some whatever agenda to get that acceptance.
Yeah, so they'll borrow from Christianity and then use that to pay off another agenda. So for instance, we don't value Christian marriage, yet we want to be married.
Yeah.
So what have we done? We have borrowed from Christianity the idea of marriage, and then we've paid off another mindset with it. Here, I'm going to offer you marriage, but it's not going to be the same thing because we can't actually get behind it because we don't want to acknowledge God, yet we want to take the word marriage, which is traditionally owned by a Christian mindset, and apply it to this thing that doesn't make sense anymore. And they're willing to accept that sort of underground currency because everyone's doing it. Because, you know, unless you're a Christian, that's what you're doing. Everybody is sort of stealing from Christianity and then using that to create a black market of emotional value and relational value and so on and so forth. So, you know, I use marriage because it's a good example. And I'm not even talking necessarily about like LGBTQ. I'm talking also about like hookup culture, you know, and the use of like sexuality. We're using, again, a covenantal expression of our physicality, where when we have sex with each other, according to Scripture, that's marriage. It's you're participating in the marriage bed. And so what are we doing there? We want to have relationships so bad, but we don't want to have relationship in the way that God gives us. So we steal this concept of a covenantal physical relationship. We give it to somebody so that we can now not feel lonely. When we do that, we feel guilty, which actually just makes it worse. And it just continues to get worse and worse and worse and worse. So what do? We steal some more, steal some more, steal some more. And so now we're all walking around saying that we're loving, that we're peaceful, that we're, what's the word I'm thinking of?
Tolerant.
Tolerant, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking of. We're walking around with these virtue signals, right, that we've stolen from God's way of being. But in actuality, they're just making us more and more guilty. That's what that looks like. You can't borrow from God that way. It just doesn't work.
It will merely point out the emptiness in your thought process and find you more wanting.
And that's kind of the mystery of how God set up his scripture, right? You take it and you use it to extol the virtues of anything but God, and it makes it so much worse for the person who's doing it. But it's rampant, right? It doesn't make sense. Why does the scientist who doesn't, what is the scientist who doesn't, because not all scientists are this way, but who doesn't believe in anything and fights to define reality through atomistic reduction, then go home and kiss their children? Like, why? Your children are a bag of cells.
Mostly water at that.
Why do you look at their desk and find why do you look at their desk and find pictures of their family? Why do you see a wedding ring on their finger? Because in order for them to deal with the stress of being a human being, they have to borrow from Christianity. They should, because they are wired to work that way. We're wired to be relational. We're wired to be thinking. So, but what does that do? That creates more and more stress. And if you put enough pressure on it, it fractures because it's not a big enough system.
Right, so that's each of the common traits that we listed out and the response to that. I saw that there's obviously furious note-taking, so these things are and will be made available to you as well. But we would like to open up and take opportunity if you had any specific questions about what we talked about today in this, not just God is Nothing, but also the introduction to worldview, to make sure that those things are answered for you. So does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask about any of the stuff that we've talked about tonight?
What was that book you said that described how Jesus Christ essentially...
Oh, man.
Is a required reading.
Yeah, we just haven't got around to teaching that class yet. Okay, I keep hitting the wrong app. It's because my fingers are fat.
Don't be phobic.
Right. You would say that as a cisgendered white male. Person of interest.
Person of interest.
Yeah.
By who?
J. Warner Wallace. So it seems like we're good in terms of understanding. I just so as we're introducing worldview, what we'd like for you to be able to do is to recognize when something has these premises, because people are not going to talk in this way, right? They're not. Some people are going to say I'm an evolutionist. Some people are going to say I'm an atheist. Some people probably are not going to say that they're nihilists because that's meaningless. But, they're probably not going to say these things. They may just say, I don't believe in God, or I don't have a belief. What we want you to be able to do is not to sort of categorize every single one of them and be like, you are this, 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 right? That is a fruitless effort because things change, the nuances change over time. What we want you to be able to do is to recognize when something meets this premise and what is the person's take on it. Because at the end of the day, the gospel message is the answering of anthropology and theology. It's being able to say, this is where you're coming from, so this is what you think about yourself, and this is what you think about God. And when you can do that, then you can actually offer hope. You can actually offer something significant. When I'm talking to a non-believer and I understand that the reason why they don't believe is because they actually don't believe in their own significance, that tells me a lot about how I can minister to them. When I'm talking to a kiddo who's into drugs or alcohol, they haven't ever been taken to church, they haven't ever read the gospel or anything. 10 to 1, if they're suffering from Well, yeah, if they're like doing drugs and things like that, and they're involved in hookup culture, 10 to 1, it's because they don't believe in their own significance. They don't believe that they are a creature who is an image bearer of God. And so because of that, they are susceptible to all of these issues, right? All the issues that are no longer on the screen. They are susceptible to all of the common traits of that. So when we talked about oppressor versus oppression, when we talked about a totalitarian rule, let's take it and let's apply it to their life. What does that mean for them? What that means is that if they follow their thought process through, in order to get through their life as it's falling apart, because they've tried all these things and it's just not working, eventually someone's going to come in and take advantage of them, right? Someone is going to take advantage of them and give them a system that uses them. And why wouldn't they allow that? Because in their system, they have no value unless they're being used, or unless they can be the user. But why would they be the user? Because they don't think they have significance. All of these things play out. And when I look at the gospel and I look at what Christ has for us, like, what is the gospel message? The gospel message is always attuned to what we need salvation from, right? And that salvation is a salvation from sin, yes, but the nuance of sin now becomes really, really important. Because a person's sin can be pornography. It can be narcissism. It can be like all sorts of different things, right? If I want to attack that sin surgically, if I want to transform them, give them a transformative message, it helps for me to understand what worldview they have. To be able to say, I'm not going to point at them and say this, well, actually I might, but to be able to say, you've probably never heard that you're significant, that you have value, that you're made in the image of God. So what message am I going to really harp on here? I'm going to really push that message forward in explaining the gospel to you. That's what's going to be successful in getting them to hear it. And this is what Jesus was all about, right? Jesus was profoundly good with very few words at being able to meet people where they were at. He understood their worldviews. And he did that across the board because the Romans had a different worldview than the Jews. And he was able to speak to both. So if we're going to be better evangelists, better mentors, better disciples, then it can't just be Christian, non-Christian. Right? It's got to be the starting point. Our starting point in this room largely is something like what we're talking about. God is nothing. Next time, we're going to talk about something a little more Eastern, which is God is everything. I want you guys to, because we live in a Western culture, I would like you guys to be thinking, before we hit the next one, about the things you're inputting. Like, think about what message is being given. Are you seeing this? Are you seeing the anthropology and the theology and what it's saying? And can you pin it down so that you can be a better evangelist, a better mentor, a better disciple?
And you have plenty of time for that. The class on God is Everything will be April 13th. That is, again, a Wednesday at 6 o'clock, just like this. Yes, John?
So, with God being nothing, what are the secular worldview, what are the biggest opinions as to how the world began, how creation started? And I know we all, some things pop in our head, Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, that's a huge one.
Whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really what it is. It's.
Yeah, but evolution has to start from something.
Well, you would think
Cosmic
so.
rays.
You would think so. There is something called kalam cosmology, which sort of argues against that. William Lane Craig is a huge proponent of something called kalam cosmology. I think he even was the person who coined the term. But for the most part, that is an unanswered question, right? And that's really what it comes down to. We can say it started here with certainty, but we don't know what came before, and we don't have to know what came before. And that's kind of the thought process. Now, when you get going into it, a lot of people, when you get into worldviews, a lot of people then will jump to the irrational, right? So you say, well, what started everything? Something had to, nothing comes from nothing, right? Well, now a person, because they want to hold that worldview, they'll jump to the irrational. They'll say, well, it's just always been. Or it's the universe. The universe is eternal. That's mystical language, right? That's spiritual language, which means now this supposed rational scientist has jumped platforms. And so you want to watch out for that. And this is where I was saying earlier, I think to Heidi's question, that what we're talking about is sort of an ideal description of a sort of, blob of the way humans think. It's a starting point for understanding where people are coming from. And I think everybody at the base who doesn't understand, who suppresses the knowledge of God is irrational at some point. You just have to figure out where that is. And for the record, from an evangelist standpoint, if you can figure out where that is, that's where you apply pressure. That's where you apply pressure and get them to understand the irrationality of their point. And you do that not by swords, which has been done in the past, which is also irrational. You do that by asking questions. How did you come to that conclusion? Socratic Method works really well, which is the asking of questions to get a person to challenge the holes in their logic so that they can fill those holes and make them tighter in explanation. So you just keep asking why. How
is it that, not why?
Well, yes. Being sloppy. Yeah. Anything else before we close out the night? All right. Hopefully this has been helpful. Again, this is Worldview 101. It is an Elders Academy class that is meant for people in the custodial path specifically, and the insight path. So that's why it's kind of set up the way it is. We appreciate your participation, and see you next time.